Welcome to the first panel on Metaethics. It's a great honor and a delight to be able to chair this panel. We're going to start with Professor Russ Shafer-Landau of the University of Wisconsin at Madison, a noted metaethicist, and we're going to turn to Daniel Starr and Michael Smith, and then if there's time, I'm going to give a brief summary comment. So, Russ, let the games begin.
All right, thanks very much. I want to also thank Jim Fleming for the very kind invitation, all the yeoman's work that you've done in putting this terrific conference together. I want to start by focusing, what I'll do is I'm going to focus on two aspects of the first several chapters of Dworkin's manuscript here, both having to do with the possibility of taking up an external perspective with regard to morality. And for those of you who now have a handout, and those I know many of you don't yet have one, I just want to draw your attention to what I call Dworkin's Thesis, the first item on the handout, which is the claim that there are no second-order external metaphysical questions to raise about the status of moral judgments. I think we can get a sense of the kind of concern that Dworkin's about by means of this quotation I also include on the handout. It says, a question, what in the world can make a moral judgment true can only be understood as itself a moral question. There's no independent metaphysical question to be answered. So on this line, putatively external questions about the status of the claims within a domain are always questions about whether specific claims in that domain are true. And in order to determine whether a particular moral claim, for instance, is true, we need to moralize, we need to get our hands dirty, we need to puzzle things out from within a moral perspective. We can't think about whether an action is immoral or a particular military, whether a particular military action or an abortion is morally permissible or not from a standpoint that's wholly free of substantive moral commitments. I agree with that, but I doubt that that thought's going to do what's needed in order to vindicate Dworkin's anti-metaphysical outlook. And in order to see that, I want to make note of three distinctions that are often elided in discussions of moral truth, and these also appear on the handout. So to get a sense of what I'm thinking about, imagine someone asking an apparently straightforward moral question. What makes it true that torture is immoral? I think this question can be asked at three different levels. This notion of level is a metaphor, but I hope it'll be clear in my remarks. The first level at which we can ask such a question is a contentful level in which we're engaged in substantive moralizing, in which we ask what the wrong-making features of torture are. And here we might cite its painfulness, its unreliability, its coerciveness. But we can also ask what makes it true that these are the features that are wrong-making features. And here we're asking really for the identity of the correct normative theory, the supreme moral principle. We might return by way of answer the thought that utilitarianism explains why coerciveness is wrong or when it is, some version of Kantianism or contractualism, things like that. These are second-level questions, but still within the realm of substantive normative ethical theory. But I think once we've landed on the correct answer to that question, and that's a huge undertaking, of course, there's still a further question about moral truth to be asked. Suppose, for instance, that we decide that some version of utilitarianism was the correct theory, the correct moral theory. We could still ask, what is it that makes utilitarianism true? What is it that makes it the correct moral theory? And I think that once we ask a question at that level, we've gone beyond substantive moralizing, we've gone beyond first-order moral questions, and we're into the realm of metaethics. And here it seems that we're focused on conceptual matters, not substantive first-order moralizing. So I introduce this threefold distinction, and especially its last level, quote unquote, in order to introduce the thought that there's a coherent perspective to take, an external perspective to take, a non-substantive, non-morally committed perspective to take on moral matters. And I want to bolster that thought by means of offering you several examples. These are the questions labeled A through G on your handout, which I'm not going to read out, which seem to me to be conceptual, not substantive questions about morality, questions that require us to do metaphysical work, questions that seem, again, to bolster the thought that there is some external perspective, a coherent external perspective to take on moral matters. I want to move now to what I identify as number 2 on the handout, and I want to I'll devote the remainder of my remarks to matters of external skepticism and Dworkin's criticisms of external skepticism. External skepticism is a family of theories, each of which shares the following idea. They're skeptical about morality and so deny that there are moral virtues or moral obligations. And they're external in the sense that they get to that conclusion without the means of any substantive first-order moral, or I'll just say generally evaluative claims or premises or assumptions. That's what makes them external. And Dworkin's thesis there, I have this on the handout as well, is that all external skeptical efforts to undermine moral and ethical thinking fail. I've reconstructed a dilemma that I take as one of the master arguments of these early chapters that's designed to show in one fell swoop that all versions of external skepticism fail. And the dilemma is either that such skeptics surreptitiously incorporate evaluative claims as moral or ethical claims in arguing against evaluative facts, and if they do that, their view is self-defeating. Or they don't do this, in which case their view violates Hume's principle, and so is false. Now, Hume's principle is here the thought that you can't derive, or I'd prefer deduce, an ought from an is. And the thought is that what external skeptics all do is they seek to, they advert to metaphysical facts about facts, that is, non-evaluative facts about the nature and extent of moral disagreement, for instance, or causal inefficacy of putative moral facts, or facts about moral motivation, in order to justify conclusions that are ought conclusions, as conclusions about the absence of any obligations or virtues or things like that. And so that's the thought that somehow every version of and every argument for external skepticism is going to fall foul of Hume's principle. I reconstruct an argument from Hume's principle on the handout. Again, I'm not going to read that out. That's just for your edification or not. And we can talk about that in Q&A. What I want to say here is that the first 2 premises are in need of support and don't receive any within the text. And so here's the first of many invitations Professor Dworkin will receive over the course of the weekend to elaborate on his thoughts. Let me just read a couple paragraphs that will be, I hope, a nice setup for what Daniel Starr is going to be saying in a few minutes. My thought is this, that Hume's principle needs to be understood as a principle about deduction. It's impossible to entail an ought from an is, or entail a not ought from an is. But Hume never denied that factual claims could non-deductively support or cast doubt on evaluative ones, and that was wisdom on his part, since factual claims can indeed play such roles. Suppose I tell you that a certain killer had no remorse, that his victim was a child who pled for his life, that the killer had many opportunities to reconsider his plan, the child suffered very greatly. That combination of facts doesn't entail the wrongness of killing, but it offers it great support. And in the absence of further facts, we have every reason to regard the action as immoral. And it's even easier to envision cases in which wholly factual claims are able to undermine, are able to cast doubt on a moral claim. And this is the analog with external skeptics. They try to introduce facts, wholly factual claims, in order to undermine moral claims. So it's even easier to envision cases in which wholly factual claims cast doubt on moral claims, even though they don't entail its falsity. Excuses play this role, and justifications do as well. That someone was literally compelled to do as she did is a fact, and yet that's going to mitigate her guilt. That's going to support a judgment about morality. It's going to support an evaluative claim, even though it doesn't entail it. Okay. What I want to do now is I want to move on to a distinction between 2 different kinds of external skepticisms. I'm going to skip the stuff about morons entirely. And I just want to make a brief comment about what's labeled 3B on the handout, characterizing error skepticism. Dworkin distinguishes error skeptics. There are 2 classes of external skeptics, error skeptics and status skeptics in Dworkin's taxonomy. Dworkin distinguishes error skeptics from so-called status skeptics in the following way. Error skeptics think all positive moral claims are false. Status skeptics think that all moral claims are neither true nor false. And yet, what seem to me to be prime exemplars in each category fall afoul of this taxonomy. Simon Blackburn, Alan Gibbard, Terry Horgan, Mark Timmons all accept that moral claims can be true or false, with many counting as true, so they don't count as status skeptics on Dworkin's characterization, and yet if they don't, who does? And the most important error theorist of the last decade, Richard Joyce, prefers to regard moral judgments as neither true nor false, rather than false. I give a supporting argument reconstructed from Dworkin's text that I call the bivalence argument. It's a supporting argument for Dworkin's position, not for my own. And again, I don't want to run through this argument. I just want to draw your attention to premise number 4, which I think is the important, crucial premise in that argument. I think it's vulnerable. I'd like to talk about that in Q&A if the opportunity arises, but I don't have time to do that here, so I'm just going to pass on. My provisional conclusion at this point is this, that Dworkin has not offered us a successful master argument that will, in one fell swoop, knock down all external versions of skepticism about morality or ethics. And what that means is that he's required to undertake a more piecemeal approach in which he's got to tackle the canonical arguments within the external skeptical camp one by one. And what I've done is I've enumerated some of these arguments. They're called the supervenience argument, the argument from categorical reasons here. They're two of a number of arguments, two of the most important of them in my judgment. And what he's got to do is he's got to spend some time and argue in detail and show us why these arguments are unsound, because if I'm right, the master arguments he's offered to show that every such version of external skepticism is false don't work. Okay, what I want to do now is just conclude with, just take another minute and talk about the last kind of external skepticism, so-called status skepticism, and I've recounted perhaps the most influential argument over the centuries on behalf of status skepticism. That's the argument from judgment internalism. Again, I'm not going to spend time reconstructing that here. But what I want to do is I just want you to think about the dilemma that's raised by virtue of the argument's conclusion. The argument's conclusion appears as line 5, no moral judgment's either true or false. And the dilemma that's raised as a result of this argument, I think, is this. Either that argument's conclusion is a substantive moral judgment, in which case Hume's law is violated because no substantive moral judgments appear in the premises, or that argument's conclusion, as I believe, is not a substantive moral judgment, in which case we've got a skeptical claim about the status of moral judgments that expresses a genuinely external perspective on morality. And in that case, such skepticism is a coherent alternative, and the argument, if refuted at all, must be refuted in detail. If I'm right, then we needn't bid adieu to metaethics quite so soon. There's still viable second-order questions to ask about moral and ethical thought. An external perspective on morality is a coherent one, and this means that there's still room for efforts to try to vindicate its status, as well as those that seek to demote it in various ways. The skeptical outlook on morality, whether expressed by an error theory or by some version of status skepticism, can't be dismissed as quickly as Dworkin and many of the rest of us would like. That's not necessarily disappointing, for it provides Dworkin an incentive to develop his criticisms of external skepticism in ever greater detail and depth. That's a very welcome and exciting prospect. Thanks.
Thank you.